I'm really happy to see all of you, or at least those of you I can still see, for the first of our digital Salon talks. I'm actually really happy that we could continue doing this particular series because the Salon talks are one of my favorite events. They really allow us to focus on in depth on a single work, and really kind of think about each painting or object in a meditative and really thoughtful way. And so I feel like it's a constant learning experience. And I think that's, if we can do that, we're doing a great job. So today this time, we've decided to do something slightly different. As all of you know, we gave everyone an opportunity to select the work that we were going to talk about today. So we gave three options. These are three paintings that I wanted to talk about. Francesco de Mura's portrait of Antonio Cersale, which was a gift in honor of Ronnie Laskin from Art Laskin, which is a fantastic work. Franz Ittenbach's Nazarene work, Mother of the World, from 1872. And of course, Maria-Theresia Van Thielen's Still Life. And as most of you know, we are here today to talk about the wonderful work of Maria-Theresia Van Thielen. There was actually really overwhelming support for this painting, which to me was just delightful. It's a particular favorite of mine. And so I'm always happy to talk about paintings I love. Not that I don't love the other paintings. I love all the other paintings, but I love this one in particular. And there's a lot to talk about with it. So it was really nice to have an excuse to kind of go a bit in depth on the research on this work and to get a chance to share all of that with you. So first of all, I thought I'd give us a little bit of context. So travel with me, if you will, back to the museum. This is where the painting hangs in the galleries. So if we were here together in person, we would be in front of the Van Thielen, which is to the right of the door. And you'd be seeing the Zerberon over my shoulder. And it's a very unassuming work. And I think it's a work that people walk past, which is a shame. But I hope that we can shed a bit more light on it today. It's actually a painting that I remember when we were working on plans for the reinstallation. Catherine and I made several trips down to storage, quite a few trips, to look at potential works to include in the reinstallation. And this was one of the works that we had on our list of things to go take a look at to assess whether it made sense to include in the gallery. And I remember when the two of us saw it, we were immediately in wholehearted agreement. This was a great piece and something that we really wanted to include. It's hard to believe that was 5 years ago, but there we are. So now you can imagine the painting in situ. You can kind of transport yourself to the gallery. And so I'll start by speaking a little bit about the artist herself. We unfortunately do not have a portrait of her, which is a real shame. We know that she was from a family that was from the Belgian city of Mechelen, which is basically equidistant between Antwerp and Brussels. And you can see quite easily that the three cities are, although they are not, on top of one another, they're a significant distance from one another. They're all located on central waterways. And so they would have been easily accessible to one another. And in fact, certainly in the Dutch Republic, we know this was the case. There were regular scheduled ferries that went back and forth between cities, essentially like a regional bus system that existed in the 17th century. So we know that for people traveling during this period, getting between cities like these would not have been an undue burden. So we know that this is the region that she is from. And we know that she was born into an artistic family. So this is her father, Jan Philip van Thielen. This is his portrait from 1662, from a book that was written by a man named Cornelis de Bij. It was called Het Gulden Kabinet, or the Golden Cabinet, which was essentially a collection of artist biographies with occasional portraits included. And he was born to a noble family in Mechelen. He was actually the Duke of, hang on, let me get his title right. He was actually the Duke of Kauenberg. In fact, de Bay mentions this in his biography, in his little sort of the caption underneath the portrait, and of course he mentions it in the biography, and he includes a Van Thielen. So Van Thielen spent his young life in Mechelen, and then in 1631 or 32, he actually left the city of Mechelen to go to Antwerp to undertake artistic training. So he was not sort of a nobleman who kind of sat about. He actually had a career planned for himself. And when he went to Antwerp, which was, of course, a major artistic center, the home of Rubens and Bruegel and other major artists, he enrolled in the studio of an artist, as was customary, and he began working for the Flemish painter Theodor Rombouts. And what you can see from these pictures is that Rombouts had a very distinctive Caravaggia style. He was known for these kind of low life, daily life kind of scenes, these kind of rowdy tavern scenes or scenes of duplicity, all painted in this kind of wonderful Caravaggia style. The Philadelphia painting is pretty fantastic on the right. And the quack-tooth puller is also a really classic example. And he's part of a whole group of artists who painted in this so-called Caravaggia style. Honthorst, and such as our picture, is a wonderful example of that particular group of artists. But when you look at Van Thielen's work, you realize that this was not his subject matter. This is not what he painted. You understand that he actually went to another artist to complete his training. So he began his training under Rombouts, and he completed his training as the only student who Daniel Segers, who was basically at this point the premier painter of Flemish flower paintings. He was the only student that Segers took into his studio. And Segers painted a whole range of different types of flower still lifes, everything from traditional bouquets of flowers, like you see on the right, to what were known as Garland pictures, which is the Mauritshuis picture on the left. And these were it's a very classic type of Flemish flower still life painting in which a sort of illusionistic effect is created with a garland of flowers, and a sculpture or sometimes a little painting of a virgin and child or what have you is placed at the center. And Segers is really known for these garland paintings. He was a really strict Jesuit, and he was also a student of Jan Bruegel the Elder. And his work was really refined, which I think you can see in these paintings, is an incredibly fine finish, incredibly careful painting style. So Van Thielen was really fortunate to have him as his teacher. And what I think you can see is that Van Thielen, and these are two examples of his work, really adopted Segers' style wholeheartedly. These are really classic examples of his bouquet pictures, again, with that same sort of polished, refined style that you see in the work of Segers. But he also painted garland pictures, and this is a really fantastic example that's in the Chrysler Museum, which shows, again, that kind of cluster of flowers surrounding an illusionistic sculpture, in this case, of the Virgin and Child. And what's fascinating about this painting is it points to another typical working method of Flemish artists, which is the combination or the coordination of two different artists working on a single painting. In this case, Van Thielen was working with Erasmus Quellinus, the younger, and so Van Thielen painted the flowers, and Erasmus Quellinus painted the sculptural illusionistic stone elements. So this was a collaborative effort. And that kind of artistic collaboration is something that you see in many Flemish artists of the time. Peter Paul Rubens frequently, quite famously, coordinated with Jan Bruegel, the Elder. They painted many paintings together, with Rubens adding the figural elements and Bruegel painting everything else. And so there are these wonderful collaborative pieces, and this is a classic example of that. Van Thielen remained in the city of Antwerp as a young artist. And while there, he met a young woman, Francesca de Hemelaar, and he married her. And he became a master in the city's Guild of St. Luke in 1642. And that was actually 2 years after the birth of his youngest daughter, Maria-Theresia Van Thielen, who is the subject of our talk today. He had 2 other daughters in quick succession. Anna Maria in 1642 and Francisca Katharina in 1645. All 3 of these daughters went on to become flower still life painters, just like their father, and they continued in the artistic profession. And ultimately, Jan Philip van Thielen and his wife had a total of 9 children. So this was a nice, large family. The family stayed in Antwerp until 1660, and that they returned at that point to their home city of Mechelen. And Jan Philip van Thielen rejoined the St. Luke's Guild in Mechelen, the Artist Guild in Mechelen at that point. And ultimately, they lived the family lived the rest of their life in Mechelen and retired just outside of the city to the family's country house. So that's sort of the story of the sort of family. And Maria-Theresia returned with the family in 1660 to Mechelen, but we know that she only remained there for about 4 to 5 years. She'd actually returned to Antwerp by 1665, which is where she lived until she passed away in 1706. And we don't have any records that she ever married. So she stayed single for her whole professional life. And now I'm showing you an example of her father, Van Thielen's work on the left. Again, that sort of bouquet of flowers in a glass vase that we looked at before. And on the right is Maria-Theresia's version of that same subject matter. Again, not the exact same bouquet, but the same type of floral bouquet in a glass vase. And you can see that she's very much adopted her father's style, that kind of fine finish, that refinement, that focus on individual flowers, the inclusion of unusual flowers in the composition, the inclusion as well of insects, frequently cabbage white little moths appear quite regularly, sometimes little caterpillars and so on. But what you do see is a distinction between their style. And this is very picky and something that is obviously much easier to see in person. But I think what is clear is that Jan Philip's style, her father's style, is a little harder. It's a little more plastic. And Maria-Theresia's style is just a little bit softer. And you particularly see that and most clearly see that if you compare the 2 pink cabbage head roses. So in Jan Philip's painting, it's the lower center of the bouquet. It's sort of the flower is kind of hanging down. You can see the way that the flower has very hard edges and deep shadowed pockets. And then on the right, Maria-Theresia's rose is sort of on the lower right-hand side of the composition. And you see that it's much softer, much more brushily painted, and those hard edges and hard shadows are not as present in her particular rendering. Now, the fact that she retained her focus on still life painting, in particular flower painting, as did her 3 sisters, and the fact that she remained single is actually not even remotely unusual. It's actually very common. Of all of the genres in which female artists could find success in the North and South Netherlands in the 17th century, still life painting was one of the most common. Artists like Judith Leyster, who the Dutch painter, who was really more the exception rather than the rule. She painted portraits and genre scenes in addition, but most female artists focused on still life because it was seen as the most appropriate genre for them to focus on. And many of those female artists remained single throughout their lives. And Clara Peters, whose work I'm showing you on the left, an early still life painter, is a great example of that, as is Maria van Oosterwijk from later in the century, whose work I'm showing you on the right. So Maria-Theresia Van Thielen falls into this larger constellation of female artists who were working in the Dutch Republic and in the southern Netherlands during this period, and finding success as painters of still life painting, finding that a very successful genre. Now, there are not a lot of signed paintings that we know by Maria-Theresia Van Thielen, our painting being one of them, which makes it quite rare. But we also know of this particular work. And this is a painting that is located in the City Museum of Mechelen, the Stedelijk Museum Hof van Boslijden. And it's a really unusual and very personal painting. It's signed and dated 1664. And it's a work that was actually not meant to be seen on its own. So it's a classic example of this kind of flower garland painting that we saw in the work of Segers and in the work of her father. But this is a very different example of that. Rather than the flowers surrounding an illusionistic sculpture of the Virgin and Child, for instance, in this instance, the flowers are surrounding this plaque with this very elaborate long inscription. And the inscription, which I'll read to you, I'll read it in Dutch and then I'll translate it for you. So it says, aan de eer mevrouw Elisabeth van Beek, jubilaris van 25 jaren in het vermaard klooster van Leliendaal binnen Mechelen, gegeven door Maria-Theresia Van Thielen, haar nicht, op de avond van de heilige Elisabeth, 1664. And so that translates to my dearest lady, Mrs. Elizabeth van Beek, celebrating 25 years in the celebrated cloister of Leliendaal in Mechelen, given by Maria-Theresia Van Thielen, her niece, on the evening of the Holy Saint Elizabeth, 1664. So that's the inscription. And we know that the feast day for Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, who is the saint that is being referenced here, was November 17th. So we know that this painting was dedicated to Maria-Theresia's aunt, who was a nun, on November 17th of 1664, which is really quite special to know a painting that specifically. It's also unusual because the painting was not meant to be displayed alone. So the painting is actually part of a sort of ensemble, if you will. The painting was accompanied by a portrait of Maria-Theresia's aunt by Peter Sonnemans. And you're seeing the work in color on the left, and then on the right is the photograph that the museum has provided of how the two works look framed, hanging with one another. And you can see the way in which Maria-Theresia's painting is basically attached with little loops down at the bottom and sort of swings free. So this is a sort of moment of celebration for this anniversary for Maria-Theresia's aunt, who is a nun. And the sort of plaque, the floral embellished plaque is a recognition of that important occasion. So it's a deeply personal painting. It's a tribute to her aunt, and it's a work that was completed at the very end of 1664, November of 1664. And we know that in the following year, 1665, Maria-Theresia actually returned to Antwerp from Mechelen. So she had sort of finished her time in Mechelen and made the decision to return to Antwerp and to take up her career again. We know as well, it's quite interesting, she's in addition to the flowers she's included, you can also see at the bottom of the composition that she's included, quite appropriately, laurel leaves, which of course are sort of traditional the sorts of things that would be associated with a victor of some sort. They're laudatory in their way. And she signs the painting at the bottom, and you can just make it out. There's at the very bottom edge of the composition in sort of that same yellow paint that she's using to sign to write the text on the script. She signs it in the way that she signed our painting, M.T. Van Thielen, fake it. So she uses the word fake it, the Latin word. So Maria-Theresia Van Thielen made this, which is actually very deliberately self-conscious. It signals that she is a woman of learning, that she is a woman who has an education, and that she understands the power and the value of her own name as an artist. So that actually brings us very handily to our own painting. Um, it's a wonderful work. It dates to 1661, which is, of course, the year following the year that the whole family returns to Mechelen. So, interestingly, both of these pictures that we know that are signed and dated by Maria-Theresia are from her time in Mechelen. So we know that she returns with her family from Antwerp to Mechelen in 1660. The year following, she paints this picture. Very much like the 1664 work that we just looked at. It's a painting that combines stonework with flowers and other natural elements. But it's also quite ambitious and quite unexpected. It's ambitious in that instead of being set in this kind of blank void, as many still life paintings are set sort of on a ledge in this kind of blank space, she's actually set the whole painting in an exterior space. So you can see the depiction of a sky, of foliage in the upper right-hand corner. And she's also included a living element, which is to say the parrot in the upper left corner, which is very much a sort of living element in the composition. He's flapping his wings. He appears to be trying to steal this little twig with 2 raspberries on it. He's really quite an animating element in the composition. The flowers in the composition are really quite wonderful. They include a rose, white morning glories, a really beautiful white and red anemone, wonderful pale pink cyclamen flowers, and then the fruits and the fruits include grapes, both yellow and purple, figs, cherries, and then both raspberries and blackberries. So there's this great kind of profusion of elements in the composition. And what you can see in this detail is that she's painting with this incredibly loose, flowing style. So this differs quite a bit, actually, from the way in which her father paints. You can see, for instance, on the pale, sort of chalky leaves of the cyclamen, the way in which she's really just kind of created the illusion of these petals with these kind of swoops of paint. And then if you look at the cluster of yellow grapes, you see a twig kind of projecting out from that bunch. And the very tail end of the twig, where there's a little bit of bark from the main branch that has clearly been snapped off, she just renders all of that in this very fluid sort of flick of her brush. So there's a real self-confidence in the way she's painting. There's a real confidence and sort of dexterity in the way she's painting. And it's really quite an extraordinary composition from that respect. Now, the parrot itself, it's very likely a variety of Amazon parrot. There are many, many, many subspecies of the Amazon parrot. But this is a genus of birds that's essentially native to the New World, which is the most important thing that we need to know. That is, it ranged from South America to Mexico and the Caribbean. So these and varied greatly depending on the particular region. It's a clearly very exotic creature. Certainly would not have been native to Mechelen of all places, or Northern Europe in general. But it is a real testament to the breadth of trading networks that existed during this period. Trading companies like the Dutch West India Company would have been in the Americas and would have easily had access to creatures as exotic as this. And so these kinds of sort of exotic pets, exotic specimens, as they would have been viewed, were really a sort of a testament to that kind of worldliness of Dutch and Flemish culture during this period. But this is not to say that 1661 is the first rendering or depiction of a parrot. Far from it. This is a really fantastic painting at the Getty. Jan Bruegel was known for his wonderful menagerie paintings. And you can see in this work at the Getty, this Noah's Ark painting in the tree on the left. It's full of parrots, including macaws and other wonderful green parrots. So there's a real sort of wonderful array of these kind of elaborate jewel-like birds, as well as other creatures that, again, were not native to Northern Europe and in any way at all. And so it's actually really speaks to a much larger point, which is that the collecting of these kind of exotic wild animals was something that was very much in vogue in Europe, even before this period. Rudolph II very famously established a menagerie, a wild animal menagerie in Prague in the late 1500s. So this kind of trade in wild exotic animals was very much dominant in European culture during this period and earlier than our painting, certainly. In addition to signaling exoticism, the parrot as a bird, as a creature to be depicted in painting, is also laden with a lot of cultural and social meaning. So parrots were very frequently featured in Dutch emblem books. The image on the left is from the author Jacob Katz's Zinnen en Minnebeelden, which is a book of the Dutch. They're called emblem books. These are essentially black and white print images of particular objects, particular scenes that were accompanied by little poems or moralizing sayings beneath them. In this instance, the parrot, the caged parrot, is a symbol of protected virtue, a woman's protected virtue. And the text beneath this particular emblem was, "A prison is far better for me than if I were at liberty." In other words, if a woman were just kind of rushing about unfettered, she could, get herself in some hot water. And thankfully, she's in this nice, safe cage, which, of course, we all have opinions on, but there you are. And then, of course, there's our wonderful Peter Cornelis von Slingeland on the right, which is another example of this kind of reoccurrence of the parrot as a sort of artistic motif reappearing again in Dutch painting of this time. In addition to the painting's details, it's worthwhile pausing and thinking about the date in which the painting was painted, 1661. So in the year prior, 1660, Maria-Theresia moved with her whole family from Antwerp, which was the city of her birth, the city she had known. She was 20 years old at the time, quite young, but really beginning her artistic career, very well on her way and clearly quite accomplished. And she's moving away from this incredibly cosmopolitan city. She is moving away from this artistic center, the home of Peter Paul Rubens, of Jan Bruegel, of Daniel Segers, and many, many other artists. And she's moving to, while Mechelen was not, a world away, and certainly was accessible to the city of Antwerp, was not the same kind of artistic center. And it would have been quite a shift for a young artist of her status and stature to make that kind of move. And I think that actually there are some other details in the painting I want to look at that I think really speak to that sort of moment of transition and what it might have meant for the young artist. One of the details in particular that I want to draw your attention to is on the garland of flowers that drapes around this kind of wonderful stone urn, which is in the right-hand portion of the composition. One of the things you'll see is that all of the vines, all of the flowers are all tucked into and woven into a black ribbon. Black, of course, being a color that we traditionally associate with mourning. And when you look at other garland paintings from the Dutch Republic and from Flemish art during this period, it's very, very rare. In fact, I can't think of another garland painting which uses a black ribbon. These are two other examples. This is another Jan Philip van Thielen. He very classically is using a pale blue ribbon as kind of an accent color to string up the flowers that are in this garland he's created. And then Adrian van der Spelt's fantastic painting from the Art Institute on the right, which does not have a visible ribbon, but which uses this wonderful illusionistic curtain actually painted by the artist Frans van Mieris as that kind of accent color. So the idea that an artist would, instead of using a brilliant color that might pick up on tones in the painting itself, would instead choose to use a black ribbon is quite striking. And I think it may speak, and again, this is me reading into the painting, but I think it may speak to Maria-Theresia's mindset. This is particularly the case when you understand other elements that were going on in her life at this moment. So they move in 1660. She paints this painting in 1661. In 1661 or 62, Cornelis de Bay, whose portrait of Maria-Theresia's father we looked at the very beginning of the talk, he publishes a book called Het Gulden Kabinet. And I'll show you here. This is on the left is the frontispiece of that particular book. And it's essentially a collection of artist biographies. It's a who's who of artists. And right immediately following the portrait and lengthy biography that de Bay includes of Maria-Theresia's father, young Philip, is a lengthy biography and a praising poem, what we call an encomium, a poem that praises her work of Maria-Theresia. The biography focuses a bit on Anna Maria and Caterina, her two sisters, but the bulk of the text actually focuses on Maria-Theresia. So it's really quite significant that just at the moment when she has been uprooted and moved, she's featured in this kind of great volume, which is this who's who of artists. It's as if you were an artist working in New York and at the sort of artistic center, and then your family uprooted you and moved you to another city, and then you got a rave review for some of your work in the New York Times. You would feel really disconnected and really pulled away from the artistic center. And so it's kind of no wonder that just a few years later, in 1965, she returns to Antwerp and settles there for the rest of her career, choosing to be an artist rather than to start a family or what have you. De Bay's Gulden Kabinet, the text of it is, and this is the case in all of his biographies, it is notoriously dense and very, very tortured, the text. But I can give you a little bit of a flavor of what he's saying about Van Thielen, and there are a few lines from the poem itself, in which he's specifically speaking about Van Thielen, that really kind of sum up the overall tone of the biography in general. And the Dutch text goes, zoals een zuiver eelpenseel ons kan betonen op paneel, bijzonder in den bloemenaard, oft heeft flora waar gebaard, which translates to, so her grand and noble paintbrush can show us on a panel the most remarkable flowering of art, as if Flora herself had gestured. So this is essentially, this focuses on the two main sort of thrusts of de Bay's biography. The first being that Maria-Theresia's style and her painting is so wonderful that it rivals nature itself, and it's also very natural. It feels as if it is a production of nature, which is very high praise in this particular moment of writing about still life painting. And then the other element that it focuses on is the great nobility and quality of her work as an artist, and value as well. So he really is recognizing her as an artist. He recognizes the fact that she's part of this sort of sisterhood of painters, but it's really Maria-Theresia who is the sort of shining light amongst these three sisters, and really kind of gets the bulk of the attention from de Bay. And it's really wonderful to see her kind of elevated in that way during her own lifetime. So she would have seen and known this biography intimately. And all of that, I think, really places our painting in greater context. It really, to me, it's allowed me to see the painting and Maria-Theresia much more clearly. I think it was a really wonderful acquisition when it was made all the way back in 1967, which actually, given that this was a specific purchase by the museum using funds that were given by Mr. and Mrs. John Schroeder in memory of their parents, given that this was a specific purchase, is quite significant, because this is relatively early on in the museum's sort of collection building days. So the Zurbaran was acquired in the 50s. So then that was the first major acquisition of or purchase of a European painting. So this is fairly new in the museum's collection building. And I think it's significant that we chose not only to acquire a wonderful Flemish still life, but a still life by a female painter. There's something to be said about that as well, which is that because this is a work by a female painter, it's quite likely that the price of this picture was less than a work by Daniel Sagers, for instance, would be. So this was an opportunity for the museum to acquire a piece, probably at a lesser price. That kind of price differential is not the case anymore, but certainly in the 60s it would have been. So I think that there was a certain amount of opportunity that the museum quite wisely seized upon. But I think it's also a really wonderful and ambitious example of Flemish still life painting, flower still life painting of the time, because it not only is this fruit and flower still life with this kind of garland motif, which is this kind of classical type of picture, but it includes these additional elements of the parrot, the exterior setting, and all of these other qualities that really help to set it apart from a more static composition. So I will draw to a close with that. And I will actually exit the screen sharing now so that we can actually have a little bit of a discussion. And like I said, if you would like to ask questions, please drop them in the chat. And Catherine has very generously offered to be our moderator today. So I will stop sharing now.
All right, that was fantastic. I love that you're able to not only read the Dutch, but understand it and say it out loud, because that is something that I would never be able to do. So that's pretty cool. Lois has a question. She says, so wonderful that we have this painting. What is its condition? Does it need conservation?
It's actually in remarkably good state. The one thing that you might have noticed, the upper right-hand corner where there's a little bit of the foliage, there's a pronounced crackler. We've not had Mark Bockrath, our conservator, look at it, but in general, it's in pretty good state, which is really nice. So I don't think it needs any conservation at the time. At least it's not on our priority list because the good state is pretty good. So.
Okay. Deborah asks, can you talk a little bit about the buyers of still life?
Oh, sure. So the thing to know about still lifes is that they were very widely collected. These were objects that were seen to be appropriate to hang throughout the house. Food still lifes in particular would have been appropriate to hang in your dining room, for instance. So there was sort of thematic integration. Still lifes that included unusual flowers or other unusual elements like a parrot or what have you would have been particularly attractive for collectors. We don't know specifically who owned our picture, which is a real shame. I know that it was purchased from the Curator Gallery in London, and I believe that they have an archive. And one of the things I'd like to do is to contact them and see if they have any more information on the original, if we can start connecting backwards to where it originally came from. But in general, still lifes like this would have been really widely collected. They were sometimes, interestingly, the objects, the expensive objects that are depicted in still lifes were actually more expensive to purchase than the painting of the object, if that makes sense. So if you wanted a very elaborate silver vessel, but you couldn't afford it, you could buy a really beautiful painting of an elaborate silver vessel and hang that in your house and kind of have the sort of equivalent of it. So still lifes were incredibly widely collected. And of course, the market for pictures in the North and South Netherlands during the 17th century was just kind of exploding. This was a period when there was a lot of wealth, particularly the North Netherlands, that poured into the country and through trade and what have you. And these were opportunities for people to really kind of establish themselves as sort of distinguished members of society. And having a painting collection really did that.
All right. Let's see. Melissa asks, where might we see other works on view by this artist?
You have to go to Mechelen, and you have to go find that person who bought the other painting that I had, like, that was sold at auction. I know of 3 paintings by her that we're aware of. There are very likely other works that are by her that either were unsigned or that the signature was lost in some way, that have been attributed to either her father or to other artists. But it's really quite sad when you look at the organization known as the RKD, the Rijksbureau voor Kunsthistorische Documentatie, the Royal Organization for the Study of Art History, which is in The Hague. And this is a collection of an image database of all of Dutch and Flemish artists working in the 17th and 18th centuries. They have 1 painting for Maria-Theresia Van Thielen, and it doesn't even include our painting. It doesn't include the Mechelen painting. So it's really she's given really, really, really short shrift. And there's one of the books that I went to look at is this great volume, which is it's just in my own personal library, and this is like a series of biographies of Dutch and Flemish still life painters, and her biography is, I'll just read it to you because it's like 3 sentences long and it's really depressing. Daughter of Jan Philip, born at Antwerp, educated at Mechelen, where she lived, remaining single. Painted flowers in the style of her father, who had been her teacher. The quality of her work is not very convincing, but better than that of her sister Anna, buried at Antwerp. That's it.
Yikes.
It's just bad.
The worst thing is, when was it printed or published, that book?
Really recently, 2003.
Yikes, yeah. Yikes. Well, I mean, you mentioned the attribution to male artists, which is something that we're going to spend a lot of years untangling all of that.
Yeah.
Because so many, because not, we're lucky that ours is signed, but yeah, most of them aren't.
Yeah.
So the other Tanya Tiffany said, "Thank you for such a wonderful talk. Could you discuss the classical allusion in the painting, i.e. Zeuxis and the grapes?"
Yes. So this is the classic story of Zeuxis and Parrot, and I have now mixed up which figure is which. But essentially, this was a painting competition in which artists were meant to outdo one another. And I believe it was Zeuxis who painted a painting of grapes, and a bird flew down and tried to pick the grapes off of the painting. So his illusion was so amazing that he fooled birds. And Parrot brought his painting out, and it's a curtain. And Zeuxis went over and tried to pull the curtain off the painting, and realized that the painting was actually of a curtain. It was an illusionistic painting depicting a curtain. And so his skill was so great that he fooled not just birds, but he fooled man as well. So anytime there's a bird present in a still life painting, that's the one I forgot to mention. That is a subtle reference to the story of Zeuxis and Parrot, and it's a really, really classic inclusion in still life painting, because still life painting is always about sort of that idea of illusionism, that idea of creating this sort of trompe l'oeil, eye-fooling kind of moment. So, good question.
Let's see. John asks, an action in the painting is the parrot stealing the fruit. Is this significant, symbolic? Kind of just answered that. A reflection of the Dutch world of trade. Mm-hmm. And let's see, Alex said that the color palette of the parrot seems to mirror that of the flowers and fruit. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is absolutely a harmony in the sort of the overall color palette of the painting in general. And I think she's very deliberately chosen a green parrot, which is actually relatively unusual. Most often in Dutch and Flemish pictures, you see African gray parrots. They appear with great regularity. And to see a green and yellow with red parrot is more unusual. I actually dug through a lot of paintings to see if I could find another one depicted. And just at a sort of cursory survey, I wasn't quite able to find precisely that parrot. So I think that she's very deliberately, but it's clearly a very specific type of bird. I don't think she's making this bird up. It correlates to this, what did I say? Amazon parrot that exists even now. And so I think she's very clearly creating a sense of color harmony in the composition, and the fact that the bird is pulling on this bright red raspberry also speaks to that kind of, there's both contrast and also harmony with the green foliage and then the red of the shoulders of the bird with that raspberry. So
Peter talking about the purple and white silver tulip. And looking in various paintings, he's seen them. Anything special about that type of tulip? Bringing to mind tulip mania. It's always tulips.
Yes. Well, that kind of striped tulip was. I mean, tulips in general were very sought after, to wit, tulip mania. But that kind of striped tulip, more unusual varieties like striped or parrot tulips, or sort of tulips with more unusual markings or formations that resulted from viruses in bulbs and what have you, were extremely sought after. So that there's a way in which these particular flowers had a value in and of themselves. Like they were luxury objects and sought after as much as, an elaborate silver vase might have been, or a Nautilus cup or what have you. But they were all the more so because they were ephemeral. It's not like this tulip is going to last forever. And so it, in a way, if you're able to spend money on an object like that, on a plant like that, it is a demonstration of wealth, because you not only can buy this very extravagant thing, but you can buy an extravagant thing that's going to die. So it's a statement of status as well.
Peter also said that he one good thing about these is that we get closer to the details, and that he never noticed the fly on the grate before, which actually I had never noticed either. So it's pretty cool.
No, it's
tiny
funny.
Little fly.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed that the ribbon was black either until I really started looking closely at the painting, and I was like, wait a minute, that's peculiar, because it's not, like I said, not something I'm used to seeing. So yeah.
So we have just a couple more questions. Kathleen said, if she was so well regarded as an artist, why are so few signed? Why would she choose not to sign her paintings, especially if she signed some of them? I mean,
that's a good question. It may be that she only signed some, or she signed some less prominently. So our painting is signed really prominently, like right on the plinth in this kind of illusionistic way. The painting in Mechelen is signed fairly prominently right along the bottom in that same yellow script as that the rest of the inscription is written in. But if she signed more faintly, just sort of in the pigment, it's not uncommon for paintings to get damaged over time and signatures to get lost, or in some cases signatures get overpainted because, like I said, the work of female artists, particularly, not right now, but particularly earlier, was valued a lot less than the work of male artists. And so a dealer looking to make more money might adjust an inscription to make his painting worth more, which is, it's the story of art history. So I think that there must be other works by her. I don't know where they are at this point. I'd have to start a dissertation to start working.
I know. Well, we actually even had a painting that was the Le Sourier, which had a signature of a male artist on it. which has now been taken off because somebody added it at some point. So, like I said,
dealers.
Yes, it's going to take a long time to undo all of that. Kathy asked if there's any other symbolism in any other the fruits, the flowers in it. Is there something about the fact that the fig is cut, or even in relationship to the artist's life?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of bloom of that, or almost overripeness of that, is significant. I think she's showing in the morning glories as well. There's like various stages of sort of open bloom. There's a crumpled bloom. There's a bud. So she's showing that kind of those various stages of development, which is really common in still life painting as an attempt to show the sort of the ephemeral nature of life, and the way in which all things eventually die. That's a really common trope, and I would imagine that's probably what the figs are referring to.
Yeah, because Kathy actually suggested even fertility, maybe.
Yep, I think that's right too. Yeah.
So yeah, and that's all the questions we have. So that's perfect timing.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. This is great.
Thank you.
Good to see all of you.
It is nice to see everybody.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.